Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into the Middle Ages, but not the version you've seen in movies. We're exploring the uncomfortable truths, the bizarre customs, and the everyday strangeness that medieval people lived with but never bothered explaining. Because honestly, they assumed everyone already knew. Before we begin, take a second to like this video if you enjoy these quiet journeys through history's forgotten corners. Subscribe if you want more. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always comforting to know our little community is gathering here as the world winds down. Now get comfortable, adjust your pillow, dim those lights, and let's drift slowly into the peculiar rhythms of medieval existence together. The permanent migration nobody mentions. One of the greatest myths about medieval people is that they stayed in one place their entire lives. Born in a village, died in the same cottage, never venturing beyond the nearest mill. Reality was messier. Medieval life was constant, exhausting relocation. People moved frequently, not because they craved adventure, but because survival demanded it. Crops failed without warning. Lords increased taxes arbitrarily. Armies marched through, consumed everything edible, and left destruction in their wake. When disaster struck, peasants didn't protest loudly. Protesting invited punishment. Instead, they gathered what little they owned, argued briefly over whether the cooking pot was worth carrying, and walked. Not toward opportunity, toward maybe this place won't kill us as quickly. Seasonal labor intensified movement. Harvest time pulled workers across entire regions. Religious festivals triggered mass migrations as thousands decided that walking for weeks to stand in a muddy field and pray was reasonable vacation planning. Pilgrimages were wildly popular, though they guaranteed blistered feet and questionable food. Travel itself was an ordeal. Roads were mud, thick, sucking, omnipresent mud. In winter, you sank. In summer, dust choked you. Signposts barely existed. Maps were hopeful fiction. Getting lost wasn't occasional. It was expected. Yet people kept moving, because staying could be worse. If your lord suddenly remembered you existed and wanted more taxes, disappearing overnight might save your life. Medieval society pretended people were legally bound to land forever. Reality quietly disagreed. Villages became revolving doors. New faces arrived. Old ones vanished. Nobody asked too many questions because tomorrow you might be the one leaving under darkness with stolen grain and growing regret. Even information moved faster than official news. A merchant with loose morals and a loud voice spread rumors across half a kingdom faster than any royal messenger. Medieval people weren't static peasants frozen in time. They were exhausted, mobile survivors, constantly fleeing problems, usually walking straight into new ones. History draws neat borders. Medieval people walked right over them, slowly, complaining the entire way. Love letters written by strangers. Romance in the medieval world was heartfelt, emotional, and frequently outsourced. Because while people fell deeply in love, most couldn't write it down. Literacy was rare, expensive, and mostly reserved for clergy, nobles, and that one irritating scholar who corrected everyone's grammar. When medieval people wanted to express devotion or uncontrollable longing, they hired professionals. Scribes, clerks, sometimes monks. Nothing kills romantic mood like whispering your deepest feelings to a celibate man judging your sentence structure. Picture the scene. You enter a small room smelling of ink, parchment, and quiet disappointment. You clear your throat nervously. "I need a love letter." The scribe nods calmly, dips his quill, and asks, "How intense are we talking?" Then comes confession. You dictate feelings out loud, slowly, carefully, while another human writes every word with the emotional distance of someone taking grocery notes. You say, "Tell her my heart burns for her." The scribe pauses, looks up. Burns spiritually or burns alarmingly? Medieval love letters followed strict formats. Opening praises, emotional declarations, vows of loyalty, dramatic flourishes borrowed from classical texts. If you weren't eloquent enough, the scribe helped. Would you like to compare her beauty to dawn, roses, or divine light? This wasn't optional. Romance had formatting requirements. Better yet, the scribe often knew both parties. Small towns offered no anonymity. Your love letter might be written by someone who baptized your crush, taught her cousin Latin, and absolutely knew she was already engaged. Professional discretion was encouraged. Professional silence was hopeful. Sometimes scribes reused phrases, not intentionally, but writing dozens of love letters yearly created patterns.
Somewhere, two medieval lovers received suspiciously similar compliments and never compared notes. Then there's delivery. Letters were carried by messengers, friends, or whoever owed favors. Privacy beyond wax seals and trust didn't exist. Anyone handling your letter could read it, laugh, or memorize your romantic desperation for later entertainment. Yet somehow, despite witnesses, reused metaphors, and monks with opinions, medieval love letters worked. People married, affairs happened, hearts broke. Love survived quills, audiences, and complete lack of privacy. Romance wasn't discreet, but it was sincere, even when dictated. And that might be the most medieval thing of all. The sinister problem of left hands. In medieval society, being left-handed wasn't a harmless quirk. It was a warning sign, a gentle suggestion from the universe that something about you was fundamentally wrong. And by wrong, medieval people meant possibly cursed, morally suspicious, or one bad day away from witchcraft. The problem started with language. The Latin word for left is sinister. That should tell you everything. Right-handedness was associated with order, righteousness, and divine favor. Left-handedness was linked to chaos, deception, and doing things incorrectly. Literally, if you reached for bread with your left hand, someone nearby frowned and reconsidered trusting you. Left-handed children were corrected early, and by corrected, I mean actively trained out of it. Teachers, parents, and religious figures encouraged right-hand use for writing, eating, praying, and basically existing. If you stubbornly favored your left hand, it wasn't seen as preference. It was seen as defiance, or worse, demonic influence. Daily rituals reinforced this bias. People crossed themselves with their right hand. Oaths were sworn with right hands raised. Important actions happened on the right side. Doing anything left-handed felt morally wrong in ways both social and spiritual. Medieval logic concluded that if the devil existed, and everyone agreed he did, he probably favored the left. Left-handed knights faced unique challenges. Sword training assumed right-handed combat. A left-handed fighter confused opponents, which sounds advantageous until you realize your own instructors didn't trust it. Being unpredictable was suspicious. Being effective while unpredictable was even worse. Medical theory didn't help. Medieval scholars believed the body was divided into moral halves. The right side was strong, warm, noble. The left side was weaker, colder, prone to imbalance. If something went wrong physically, the left side was often blamed. Because of course it was. Despite all this, left-handed people persisted. They worked, fought, wrote, cooked, and survived quietly using the hand that felt natural. Many simply learned to switch in public and revert in private. Medieval code switching, but for hands. So if you were left-handed in the Middle Ages, congratulations. You weren't evil. You weren't cursed. You were just living in a world deeply offended by your coordination. History has many villains. Sometimes one of them was simply the left hand, living without mirrors. In the medieval world, self-awareness existed. Self-reflection did not, at least not visually, because for most people, mirrors were rare, expensive, and wildly impractical. The average medieval peasant went through life with only a vague, second-hand understanding of what their own face looked like. Glass mirrors were luxury items owned by nobles, monasteries, or that one suspiciously wealthy merchant who never explained his income. Polished metal mirrors existed but were small, dull, distorted,
and often showed you a version of yourself that looked permanently annoyed and slightly melted. For most people, the closest thing to a mirror was water. Ponds, wells, buckets, rivers. These offered fleeting glimpses, usually warped by ripples, shadows, or the sudden realization that you might fall in and drown. You didn't linger. You glanced, accepted whatever vague shape stared back, and moved on. Medieval people learned what they looked like through descriptions. Other people told them, not kindly. You have your father's nose. Your eyes are too close together. You look exhausted. This was your mirror. Social feedback. Brutal, unfiltered, unavoidable. Personal grooming was approximate. Hairstyles were practical, not aesthetic. Beards were trimmed by feel, not appearance. If your hair looked uneven, someone would eventually mention it. Loudly, publicly, with unnecessary enthusiasm. The idea of checking your appearance before leaving the house simply didn't exist. You left and hoped for the best. If no one laughed immediately, you assumed things were fine. Confidence was easier without visual proof otherwise. Portraits didn't help either. Most people never had one. Even when they did, medieval art wasn't aiming for realism. Artists focused on symbolism, not accuracy.
A portrait might show you looking serene, noble, symmetrical, none of which were guaranteed in real life. This disconnect between identity and appearance created strange freedom. Medieval people weren't obsessed with how they looked because they literally couldn't be. Vanity required access. Access required money. Most people had neither. Medieval society judged you by actions, reputation, family, and whether you smelled tolerable, not by jawline or complexion. In a world without mirrors, self-esteem was built on survival, not selfies. And honestly, that might be the most medieval achievement of all. When objects became family. One of the strangest facts about medieval life is how emotionally attached people were to their possessions. Not in a modern consumer way. There was no impulse buying, no seasonal upgrades, no treat-yourself mentality. When you owned something in the Middle Ages, it was because you desperately needed it, and chances were you'd own it for most of your life. Naturally, people started naming these objects. Tools were the most common candidates. A shovel wasn't just a shovel. It was the shovel. The one that helped you survive winters, dig fields, bury relatives, and occasionally threaten aggressive geese. When something does that much emotional labor, it earns a name. Axes, plows, knives, cooking pots were often referred to as if they were co-workers rather than property. Weapons were especially personal. Swords, daggers, shields frequently had names. Sometimes serious, sometimes oddly affectionate. A blade that protected you in battle wasn't metal. It was a companion. Breaking it wasn't inconvenient. It was tragic. People didn't say my sword snapped. They said I lost him. But it didn't stop there. Ovens were named. Doors were named. Bells were named. If an object was central to daily survival, it crossed the line from tool to personality. An oven that baked good bread was praised. One that failed was insulted. Loudly, repeatedly, in front of others. This wasn't superstition. It was practicality mixed with exhaustion. When your entire life depended on a handful of objects functioning properly, you developed relationships with them. You spoke to them. You blamed them. You thanked them. Medieval people lived close to the edge, and anthropomorphizing a shovel was healthier than screaming into the void. There was also a legal side. Named objects appeared in wills. I leave my good knife to my eldest son. Not just any knife. The good one. Everyone knew which one that meant. Objects carried memory, reputation, history. Losing them was losing identity. Even repairs carried emotional weight. A patch tool wasn't inferior. It was experienced. Scars meant reliability. A tool fixed a dozen times had proven it deserved to stay. In a world with very few possessions, each one mattered. Medieval people didn't just own objects. They lived with them, worked with them,
and sometimes curse them like old friends who refuse to cooperate. Honestly, naming your shovel makes perfect sense when your shovel is the reason you're still alive. The shoe that lasted a lifetime. In the medieval world, shoes were not fashion. They were not accessories. They were survival equipment. And losing a shoe was less, oops, and more. This might actually ruin my year. Leather was expensive. Skilled labor was expensive. Everything involved in making shoes required time, animals, and a cobbler who probably had strong opinions and limited patience. Most people owned exactly one pair of shoes. One. And those shoes were expected to endure fields, mud, stones, animal waste, winter frost, summer heat, and whatever mysterious liquids medieval streets offered. Instead of replacing shoes, people repaired them constantly. Soles were stitched, restitched, patched, layered, reinforced until the original shoe was less footwear and more historical artifact. A medieval shoe could contain leather from 3 different animals, repairs from multiple decades, and enough stitching to qualify as textile thesis. Cobblers were everywhere and deeply respected. Not glamorous, but essential. A good cobbler could extend a shoe's life for years, sometimes decades. If you found one who worked quickly and didn't judge you for the smell, you stayed loyal forever. Shoes were so valuable they appeared in wills. Parents passed them to children. Older siblings inherited shoes that had already seen too much. Breaking in new shoes wasn't painful because they were new. It was painful because they were someone else's old ones. If a shoe failed during winter, bare feet on frozen ground wasn't inconvenient. It was dangerous. Frostbite didn't care about financial situation. People wrapped feet in cloth, straw, or whatever material existed until the cobbler could perform miracles again. This explains why medieval people walked carefully, deliberately. Every step mattered. You didn't sprint unless chased by something worse than losing a shoe.
You avoided puddles, not for cleanliness, but shoe preservation. In a world without cheap replacements, durability was everything. Shoes weren't discarded. They were managed, loved, maintained, argued with. When you picture medieval life, remember this. Those worn-out, misshapen shoes weren't signs of poverty. They were signs of responsibility. If your shoes lasted, you were doing something right. The fear of being forgotten. One quiet fear haunted medieval life more than war, famine, or disease. Being forgotten. Not dying. Dying was expected. Being erased, that was unbearable. In a world with no photographs, no recordings, and very little written documentation, memory was fragile. If no one remembered you, it was as if you'd never existed. Medieval people were deeply uncomfortable with that idea. This is why people obsessed over names. Children were named after parents, grandparents, saints. Occasionally that one uncle everyone agreed deserved another shot. Naming wasn't creative, it was archival. You weren't honoring someone. You were keeping them alive through repetition. Gravestones, when they existed, mattered enormously. Even the simplest marker, a carved symbol, a scratched name, a rough cross, was a declaration. I was here. I mattered enough to be remembered. If you couldn't afford stone, memory had to do the work instead. Stories became tombstones carried in your head. This fear also explains why medieval people loved witnesses. Contracts were spoken aloud. Promises were made in groups. Events were public. If enough people saw something happen, it became real. If no one saw it, it might as well have never happened. Privacy wasn't romantic. It was risky. Church records existed partly for the same reason. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, all carefully logged. Not just for God, but for memory. Being written down meant permanence. Being unwritten meant vanishing quietly into history's mud. Even medieval charity had a memory angle. Donating to a church often came with one request. Say my name in your prayers. That wasn't spiritual vanity. That was insurance. As long as someone spoke your name, you weren't gone. Ironically, this obsession worked.
Centuries later, we still know names of ordinary people because they were stubborn enough to leave marks, records, symbols, or stories behind. Medieval people didn't chase fame. They chased remembrance. They lived knowing their time was short, their world unstable, and history forgetful. They fought that reality the only way they could, by making sure someone, somewhere, remembered their name. Which is why you're hearing about them now. When silence meant danger. In the modern world, silence is marketed as luxury. People buy noise-canceling headphones, book silent retreats, proudly announce they need quiet. Medieval people, however, heard silence and immediately assumed something had gone terribly, spiritually wrong. A silent medieval house was not peaceful. It was suspicious. Noise meant life. Talking, coughing, praying, animals shuffling, tools clanking. These were reassuring sounds. If a home went quiet, it suggested illness, death, or the presence of something that preferred you not notice it. This fear had religious roots. Silence was associated with graves, the afterlife, and the unknown. Churches echoed on purpose, filling space with chanting, bells, and prayer. Bells rang constantly for timekeeping, warnings, celebrations, funerals, emergencies, and sometimes just because someone thought the silence was getting ideas. Homes followed the same logic. People talked while they worked. They sang while they cooked. They prayed out loud. Even alone, many people muttered to themselves. Not because they were strange, but because being audibly present felt safer. Silence implied abandonment. Sound implied protection. At night, silence was especially dangerous. Darkness already belonged to spirits, demons, and theological anxiety. Add silence, and you had a perfect environment for imagining footsteps, whispers, or divine judgment creeping behind you. A crackling fire, even a weak one, was comforting, not just for warmth, but for sound. That gentle noise reassured you the world still functioned. This also explains medieval group sleeping habits. People didn't just sleep together for warmth. They slept together because shared breathing, shifting, and occasional snoring created soundscape that pushed back the void. A room full of noise meant no one had died quietly during the night, which was always a concern. Even monasteries, famous for silence, structured it carefully. Silence wasn't absence of sound. It was regulated, ritualized, heavily supervised. Unplanned silence, that was unsettling. To medieval ears, silence wasn't calm. It wasn't healing. It wasn't restful. It was a warning. And in a world where danger was constant and explanations limited, making noise was one of the easiest ways to feel alive.
If medieval people seemed loud, repetitive, or annoyingly chatty,
Remember, they weren't filling space. They were keeping it away. Good night. Life in the Middle Ages wasn't the adventure we imagine. It was repetitive, occasionally harsh, mostly just ordinary. But within that ordinariness lived millions of people who laughed, loved, worried, and survived. History remembers kings and battles, but medieval life was built by people whose names were never carved in stone. They named their tools. They feared silence. They walked endlessly. They hired scribes to write love letters. They lived without seeing their own faces clearly. These weren't grand gestures. They were small adaptations to a world that offered very little certainty. And somehow, through all of it, they found meaning. They raised children. They taught skills. They maintained traditions that outlasted empires. The Middle Ages you lived in wasn't the Middle Ages of legend, but it was the one that mattered most. The one that kept the world breathing, working, surviving, day after unremarkable day. And now, as your eyes grow heavy and sleep approaches, you can rest knowing that tomorrow will come, bringing with it the same routines, the same challenges, the same small comforts that make life bearable. The world will wake. You will wake with it. Good night.